Where are China-EU trade relations heading? Bilateral trade between the two sides last year reached $786 billion with investment up to $260 billion. At the same time, the China-Europe Railway Express has become a golden passage linking Asia and Europe, running more than 100,000 cargo trips so far. Yet, despite these achievements, frictions remain as the EU has moved to curb Chinese medical device makers' access to public procurement contracts and has slapped high tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. This comes after the EU designated China as a partner for cooperation, an economic competitor, and a systemic rival. How tenable is this approach? Can you be both a partner and a systemic rival? What are the expectations for China-EU trade relations going forward? And how are U.S. protectionist policies impacting China-EU relations? Welcome to The Point with me, Liu Xin, coming to you from Beijing. I'm pleased to be joined from Berlin by Andreas Hube, member of the Federal Management Team at the German Federal Association for Economic Development and Foreign Trade, or BWA. He's also co-founder of China Bridge. From Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, by Arnaud Bertrand, a French commentator on economics and geopolitics and CEO of Chinese medicine company Mi and Qi. From Beijing, by Zhou Mi, Deputy Director of the Institute of American and Oceanic Study at the Chinese Academy of International Trade and Economic Cooperation. And also from Beijing, by Aina Tangen, a Senior Fellow at the think tank Taihe Institute. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. China's Minister of Commerce, Wang Wentao, met with EU Commissioner for Trade and Economic Security, Marcos Sefcovic, on the sidelines of a World Trade Organization ministerial meeting in Paris on June the 3rd. And a statement from the Ministry of Commerce says this: the two sides conducted concentrated, candid, and in-depth discussions on urgent and important topics surrounding China-EU economic and trade cooperation, and asked both teams to intensify efforts to make preparations for important agenda between China and the EU this year. Andreas, this comes against the backdrop of ebbing and flowing trade relations with robust trade in places, but also rising concerns in some other areas. What do you make of the current situation in China-EU relations?
Well, thank you for the question. Basically, we see that there's the 50 years we're actually having trade together and working together is substantial, and I think basically it's a very strong foundation which is very much based on trust. I mean, it's we saw up and downs, and I think very much important is that we see now, especially the trust also from China into Europe, despite the challenges that in 2024 we actually had a massive FDI improvement in terms. I think it's more than 47% an increase, reaching more than $10 billion euros, which we haven't seen actually since 2016, 2017. So I think they're very strong signs in the EV sector. We see challenges for sure. On the other side, I think we and also our members, when we talk about cooperation, see China really don't really follow a kind of decoupling strategy, but really see many times that investing in China is, and trusting out China in this way, is the way forward. So we're actually very, in this way, positive. There are always challenges, but we are seeing mutual way of finding solutions to this.
On May the 6th this year, Chinese President Xi Jinping exchanged congratulatory messages with the European Council President Antonio Costa and European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen to celebrate the 50th anniversary of diplomatic ties between China and EU. As Andreas mentioned, Chinese President Xi also noted that he would like to take the 50th anniversary of this relationship as an opportunity to deepen strategic communication, enhance understanding and mutual trust, consolidate the positioning of the partnership, expand two-way opening up, and properly handle frictions and differences. Arnaud, let me go to you. Is he hitting the nail on the head as to what the two sides needs to do? Are we seeing exactly the demonstration of the kind of hesitation that we're seeing on the part of some in the EU, maybe?
Well, I think China's approach to the EU, and this is very clear from President Xi's message, which is he doesn't want to lump the US and the EU together. He's always trying to encourage Europe to be an independent entity, geopolitically speaking. And I think we are seeing, especially with the Trump tariff, this is becoming from the Europe side more and more a reality. You're clearly witnessing right now a bit of a rift, even a major rift between Europe and the US, of course, because of Trump tariffs and Trump's approach to Europe. And as a result, I think this really has the potential to, like President Xi said, deepen the relationship between China and Europe, because it has to be said, a lot of Europe's hostile approach to China on things like semiconductors and on topics like that was also in large parts driven by the US. And so if Europe separates itself from the US in some way, we're likely to see a more constructive relationship, I think.
On June the 2nd, as I mentioned, the EU reportedly moved to curb Chinese medical device makers' access to public procurement contracts worth more than 5.7 million US dollars under its international procurement instrument. Arnaud, let me stay with you a bit more. What do we know about the details of this development? I understand it is not official yet, correct me if I'm wrong. Is it a totally new and sudden development, or has it been in the making for some time, according to your knowledge?
So according to my knowledge, it's been in the making for a few months, and it stems from an investigation that was made by the EU on market access for EU the medical device makers in China. They say that they found evidence that China had measures in place to favor Chinese device makers over European ones in China. And so their point is that because they don't do the same in Europe, and that Chinese medical device makers have the same market access as EU companies in Europe, it's an unfair situation. And they're saying that it's their move to restrict market access for Chinese medical device makers is a retaliatory move against the market access that EU firms have in China. Again, the extent to which that is effectively the case, I don't know.
Mr. Zhou, what is your understanding of this potential policy, and is it really retaliatory move on the part of EU? Because how European medical device makers are treated here in the Chinese market, what's your understanding?
Well, it is true that public procurement is a kind of a very special areas for many countries. So if we are looking at WTO as example, we know WTO has the most favored nation treatment for many of the products, but according to my knowledge, that government procurement is one exception. So when we're talking about that areas, the agreements are based on the plurilateral levels, that is the government procurement agreements among those members. Well, EU is one of its members, but China is not. So actually, when they are trying to do something, maybe they can do something special to Chinese companies. But according to my knowledge, Chinese government are not trying to discriminate the producers from different countries. According to our law of the government procurement, if any suppliers who are making the products in China, they have the fair treatment when they're under the mechanism of the government procurement. So when we talked with the EU counterpart, I think that for many of these areas, EU is trying to do fairly to all the producers from different countries. So this time it is really surprising, because we are seeing the world is under pressure and de-risking is not an excuse. So they should try to treat every country fairly, in my understanding.
So basically you're saying this move is targeting Chinese medical device makers specifically and not to anybody else. Is that the case that we're seeing here, Mr. Zhou?
Well, in my understanding, that the message has been sent is just targeting in Chinese manufacturing of those, the medical devices. So this is very special, and it's not so fair to Chinese producers.
Aina, what is your read of the situation, and why is the EU sending us such policy or formulate such policy while they understand China is a very important partner at times like this? And I think everybody understands what I'm talking about.
Well, Lucian, I mean, they're trying to make sure that they're not going to be a pushover. I mean, obviously, 1 year ago, the talk was about de-risking from China. Well, it's turned out that the U.S. is the unreliable partner, and it's the EU which is looking to de-risk from the United States. In the meantime, there aren't a lot of other partners out there. China has the markets, obviously has production. But, when you start looking at issues like this, it's not as simple as it seems. First off, it was only for it's a 5-year policy. They can reverse it at any time. But the issue here isn't all of this other stuff that people have been talking about. It comes down to Chinese medical devices have been beating the Europeans in their own market. And the government is looking to protect them. And they're allowed to do that under WTO rules. Today we had a conference.
So there's nothing wrong with this policy?
Well, it's nothing wrong, but it sends, a bit of a signal. But I think the signal really is we're not going to be pushed over. I mean, where is the EU going to go right now? They have a very, very tough situation. So they're trying to mark out territory and say, we're going to protect our own, but we want to be friendly. As I said, this is a sea change from where we were a year ago. And they're going slow. It's very uncomfortable for van der Leyen to be singing the praises of China when, since she got to the EU, she's been singing how possibly difficult China is. Now, the main message people should take away from this is at the time that the EU is looking for protectionist measures, China has been continually opening up its market. It's getting ready to apply to the TPP, or TCTPP as it's called now. And part of that is opening up government procurement, and it's done so. So you have the one that everyone said you need to de-risk from, they're not being fair, actually moving the direction of a world trade agreement honoring those things. And the EU, which has for years championed this idea of free trade, is now moving in the slightly opposite direction. But like I say, a lot of this is signaling.
Andreas, now China's Ministry of Commerce and the China Chamber of Commerce to the EU have criticized the move, warning it undermines fair competition and erects new trade barriers. The department advised the EU to adhere to WTO rules. What's your response to the statement? If the relevant parties are advising the EU to adhere to WTO rules, clearly they deem it a breach of WTO rules.
Yeah. Well, I can't comment in the details there. I think it's important just from a general perspective, because we have businesses dealing with each other, that we keep the open dialogue. And I think basically the European Union is aware of the positions where we are now right now. We need to be confident for sure. We need to be fair. It's not only that Europe is taking measures only against China, it will take similar measures against other countries if it was. But I think as long as the matter says factual, they will actually look into the details, find a solution, and I don't think it will massively impact the overall cooperation, because you're going to China and you are going to have this summit soon. In this context, basically, I think many aspects will be addressed. And in the end, we clearly hope that we actually will also go back to the CAI in terms of which has been actually addressing many of the concerns which potentially are coming up now again, and that we really, after all these negotiations about the CAI, we come to a final conclusion and potentially can move ahead. And this maybe will also further stabilize and actually to the
What's your
relationship
feeling? Yeah,
between
what's your
the-
feeling on the ground? Because you are closely in contact with the business community in Europe, in Berlin especially, and you are also in touch here on the ground with their Chinese counterparts. Let's talk about the mood among the business community in Germany, in Berlin. What are they saying about relations with China, and what is the mood there?
Well, again, exactly. I can tell you actually from the basis, basically from the companies, from the dialogues which are happening, we see a massive increase in terms of Chinese delegations coming to Germany, which was very much lost during the COVID time. We've seen strong interest and actually, I think also an increased awareness and among especially German companies in those critical sectors for Germany, like automotive sector, that they understand that China is really a global player. And that's also another thing is which we more and more also try to make sure companies or everybody understands that you can't just look at China as a geography or a market. You need to understand China as a global power. You can't deal with Paraguay without thinking of China, for example, and other markets. So basically, I think it's the overall awareness and that we actually have a very constructive and open, how to say, exchange and understanding. It doesn't mean that we have to like everything, but it's important that we at least try to understand and really look into mutual benefits. And in the end, basically, we are a very strong advocate of what we call business diplomacy, because through trade and through work together, we can understand each other and hopefully in this way also influence, give the right impulses to the politicians on both sides.
Mr. Zhou, China clearly sees EU as a very important partner. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the show, the China-Europe freight train has been running for quite some time, and some 100,000 trips have made. Lots of goods being transported both ways, but mostly from China to Europe, I understand. What explains this huge increase in demand and the contrast that we're potentially seeing among the mindset of some people in Europe about trade with China?
Well, in my understanding, there may be several reasons. The first one is definitely what we can do. Actually, for Chinese manufacturing, that we are able to produce so many products in different kinds of categories, which rarely are kind of very precious, products that the EU markets can depend on. Although there have been so many, uncertain, unstable, or disruption of the supply chain. China's supply is very stable. So we are increasing not only the transportations over the oceans, but over the land. So I think that is probably one of the reasons. And second, I think that the resilience of the supply chains are accompanied by technology improvements. Though the e-commerce are providing better opportunities for both sides to meet each other's abilities. I think that is really a good thing that's supporting the both sides. And the third one, I think that is also the attitudes of both governments. The EU governments and the Chinese governments are really trying to establish a better mechanism to reassure that the businesses can be stable and continued. And if you are looking at some of these actions, I think the Chinese government is trying to import more things from the EU side, like from the agricultural products to the tables of the Chinese families. We are trying to import more things from them. So it is kind of a very good effort that we want to do more to improve the resilience between our two parties' trade.
Actually, some statistics here actually say the same thing about two-way trade. Despite whatever tension we're seeing, China and EU have actually a very strong economic and trade relationship. Bilateral trade in the beginning was only 2.4 billion US dollar. Now it's $800 billion annually, an increase over 300 times. Aina, what's driven this extraordinary surge in trade? Are we going to see this trend continue? What potential benefits can people in Europe reap from increasing trade with China?
Well, a lot of it's efficiency. The logistics are there. Whether you choose to use them or not is up to each individual country. But if you don't do it, your people suffer. They'll be paying more for the same products. Going back to the medical issue, keep in mind that 20 years ago, GE was importing 70% of all the parts for its medical machines back to the United States from China. And that was, they targeted that increase above 90%. So even though these medical devices are being sold under German or French names, the fact is the components, the intermediate goods, are still coming from China. And that's whether a lot of those trains are there. In terms of the benefits, Europe, like the United States, has to realize that you have to play to your competitive advantages. Europe's universities and their technological know-how should be putting them far ahead of where they currently are. I think Arnaud can speak to this, that Europe does not support its homegrown heroes. It always turns to the United States. I think those days are over. They have to have indigenous innovation and be selling that to the world in an area where they can exceed what is being offered by others. This is what China has done, first with hard work, and now with intellectual power.
And now the United States has lifted its tariffs from 25% to 50% on products from EU. In response, the EU has said it is prepared to impose countermeasures, including retaliation for the latest hike. And Reuters reported that facing disruption from US tariffs, the EU and China are negotiating a relaxation of the European levies. Andreas, what can you report on that regard? Do people in Europe, businesses people and politicians, realize that China is part of the solution at times like this, and not just for times like this?
Yeah, I think you're right. In terms of people like we in Europe, basically, I think there's a certain drive to realize that we need to be stronger, that we need to be independent, that we basically doesn't mean that automatically by the US imposing high tariffs on Europe, we will automatically choose out other partners. But I think it's really the kind of, as we said earlier, also this wake-up call to really understand that we need to stand united as Europe, really focus on our strengths and work also very much on with the partners and understanding the partners. I mean, let's face it, China and US both are very strong interest-driven, and we should maybe also be more interest-driven. And it doesn't mean that when we are following our own interests, that doesn't mean that there are no ways to cooperate. Opposite. I think if we really understand where our both mutual interests are, we can really find areas. I mean, also, as I said earlier, it's important, again, speaking of Germany, to understand where our weaknesses, where we may be strong before, and maybe now we really have to evaluate our position. Do we know, like the car industry talked about, but there are other industries. For example, when you talk about AI, I mean, Germany has a very strong, France has a very strong position around AI. If it especially comes to applied AI, if it comes to industrial AI, there are areas where we can really cooperate with China. And also, as I said earlier, understanding China in a new way, working also, for example, for startup enterprises. We see many startup companies in Germany having focused just on Germany and facing difficulties. There are ways that we actually can work with China together, and we have those conversations right now to see how can we work with China in a different way to really drive co-innovative approaches and also driving a new set of trust and forgetting potentially old perceptions in terms of cooperation in the technology area. And these are very exciting times. So overall, I think this is where, yes, you always say, where there's a crisis, there can be a challenge, but very much also an opportunity.
Arnaud, do you share the same kind of optimism? Do you think Europeans are ready to understand and even to trust their Chinese counterparts?
I actually think there is plenty of things that could be done between China and the EU. So AI is a perfect example to me because you always hear this rhetoric from the US that America is going to win the AI race, right? That doesn't only concern China, that also very much concerns Europe, right? Because what does it mean, winning the AI race? AI is going to be big, it's going to transform everything. Of course, Europe very much wants a piece of that pie, and so does China. And I think that both Europe and China have a similar mindset when it comes to AI. In fact, there was a summit, an AI summit in Paris, and there was a final statement at the end, which both China and the EU, European countries signed, but the US didn't sign. So, which is a clear sign that there is a similar mindset, a similar approach to AI to the US. So why not partner on this? Try to, do some sort of technology partnership on AI to develop it in a way that favors European and Chinese interests in order to have a level playing field against the US. Or another extremely clear area where we could partner with China is Africa. We rarely speak about Africa in Europe, but it's potentially an enormous opportunity. It's going to be 3 billion people by the end of this century, right at our doorstep. China is doing a lot of things there, and the EU says it wants to do things, but doesn't quite know how to do it, and there is a lot of pushback against Europe in Africa. Why don't, instead of competing against China in Africa, why don't we do a joint initiatives in order to help Africa develop, which would be beneficial for everyone, for Africans, and also for Chinese and European companies to have 3 billion people market rate for their products. So I think if we get creative, there are so many things that we could do together.
Mr. Zhou, what is China's position? What is China's strategy when it comes to its policy towards EU? Is China going to be consistent here? Because China has been, to my understanding, pretty much advocating the same thing despite the ups and downs on the other side. And now China is reaching out for the same messages, basically.
Well, in my understanding that you are totally right that China is keeping its promises that we are sticking to the multilateralism, while EU is also another very important part of that. As bilaterally, I would say that Chinese government and also enterprises are really taking the values of EU markets as that integral one. So we are trying to improve the collaboration based on the products, on the technology innovation, and all the other areas. I would also mention that it is really a very important time for EU to do business with China, because we are seeing that the United States is trying to put more tariffs on the import of the intermediate and raw materials from China, while EU is suffering from the subsidies of the United States on the challenges about the competitiveness when they are attracting the businesses to working in the EU part. So they can import more from China, and that is keeping their competitiveness against their competitors in the US side.
Okay, we have to leave it there. Unfortunately, time has run out, but it's a story that will continue developing, and it will impact all of us. So we will keep a close watch on the situation. Many thanks to my guests, Andreas Hube, Arno Bertrand, Jomi, and Ina Tangen, joining us from different parts of the world.